Hello, everybody. My name's Sean Brillant. I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and I have Kim Davies here with me from UNBSJ. We did a webinar, and what we wanted to do is find some time to come back and answer some of the questions that many of you had posted for us to answer, and we just did not have the time to answer and get to all of them. And so now here's our chance. So we're going to try and go through those questions. So thank you, Kim, for joining me again to go through these questions, because you can answer most of them better than I can, probably.
Thanks, Sean. It's always nice to talk to you.
So first, since the whale population has disappeared completely in 2010 and wasn't a gradual decline, was there a singular event that caused a shift in the North Wall Gulf Stream? Kim.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the ocean undergoes sometimes rapid shifts in ocean process. So we call these regime shifts. So climate change, you think of this as a gradual process that's causing the ocean to warm. Well, it's also having impacts on stratification and on the movement of water, so that sometimes the warming hits a tipping point and causes big shifts to occur over a very short time span. And so we think this is what happened in 2010, that there was some sort of a threshold in the physical oceanography that was reached and caused the water masses to suddenly change. But we don't know at this time exactly what caused the North Wall to change that year as opposed to 2011 or 2009. We don't know. We know that it's related to the slowing of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is the global conveyor belt that transports water all over the world. And as that starts to slow down, as the water starts to warm, that will cause the Gulf Stream to start to slow and meander, and it will start to flood into the Gulf of Maine. And we think that's what we've been seeing since 2010.
So related to that, there was another question. Will these right whales travel to other places within the Atlantic to respond in response to these changes? That's an interesting question.
Yeah. And again, this is really very much an active area of research, but we know that the right whales, when they departed the Scotian Shelf and Bay of Fundy, they went north and they went south. So they were looking in multiple different places for good forage, and they found maybe some in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in a couple of different places, and also some around southern New England. So yeah, absolutely. They seem to be, for now, staying in the temperate Atlantic region, as long as those habitats remain productive. And if those habitats are no longer productive, who knows where they might go.
Well, and of course, I think we mentioned this as well. You know, we are only seeing about a third of the total population coming to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So clearly 2/3 are somewhere else that we're presently unaware of. And as an example of the fact that they will go anywhere in the Atlantic, frankly, over the end of year and end of 2020 into 2021, a calf, right whale calf, was found in the seen in the Canary Islands, way out in the middle of the Atlantic. So these whales will go everywhere in the Atlantic. It is not such a big thing, apparently, for them. Okay, let's move on. Does the Canso Causeway that was built in the 50s pose any significant blockage for the whales in relation to the Gulf of St. Lawrence?
No, they won't travel through there because it's too shallow, I think. What do you think, Don?
Right. Yeah, I agree. We don't see, if that was the case, we would probably see whales approaching it from either the north or the south, and that's often not the case. We do see other animals doing that. So for example, leatherback turtles will often come in and find out there's the causeway at Canso and then go around Cape Breton when they're migrating south. But for right whales, it doesn't seem to be the case. So that's good.
Yeah, right whales tend to migrate in a little bit deeper water, a little bit further offshore. Yeah. They don't tend to come right into the coast when they're migrating.
Yeah. A next question, may we assume that whale sounds are the same irrespective of the geographical location they may be in? This is interesting. I mean, do the whales make different sounds in different spots, Kim?
Yeah, I mean, they'll make Sure, they'll make different sounds in different spots. Uh, all right whales make this one sort of call that's a communication call called the up call, and we know they make that particular call all demographic groups in all habitats. But there's other kinds of calls that seem to be more habitat specific, and that's because they may be specific to a particular demographic group, or they may be specific to a particular behavior. So, for example, males, when they're making aggressive displays to other males, they'll produce a gunshot sound, and you tend to get more gunshots occurring in Roseway Basin, which is a male-dominated habitat, and also it's during a time of year when we see a lot of male aggressive behavior. So you've got behavior, you've got demographics. Mothers and calves make particular calls to communicate between the two of them. So we would expect to see those calls more often in habitats where mothers and calves are present.
Right. Also, I mean, I'll just mention that there is recent research that shows that these whales are actually singing. They're actually making sequences of noises. So are they making different songs? We don't know yet. We've only just recently discovered that they're actually making songs at all. So that's astounding. You must hear these sounds pretty often, eh? You must be listening to them, Kim. This isn't a question from the group. This is just for me. Can you make an up call sound? Are you able? Are you able to? Never mind. I won't put you on the spot.
I mean, I've done it for classes before, but it's
okay. No worries.
No. I'll do it. So this.
Okay.
And it's a very haunting sound. It's very ghostly because when it's being recorded by a hydrophone that's under the water, it might
There's
come
nothing.
from water, several kilometers away, and it's passing through this kind of ghostly liquid environment and gets a very haunting sort of quality to the sound.
That's a good job. And actually that sounded exactly like a right whale up call from my experience. Good job. The gunshot, by the way, sounds just like a gunshot. It's amazing. Yeah. It's like kapow. That's what it sounds like when they make that sound. That's amazing. So, okay. Another question. If the right whales continue north, will they compete with bowhead, or possibly will the right whale population in the Atlantic and Pacific potentially breed?
I'm skeptical that would be the case on either front. And the reason is, well, I'm not skeptical that right whales would go further north. I think that they could, and that they probably would if there was no food in the more temperate zones, and especially as the climate changes and the regions that are now subarctic become more temperate-like, then right whales probably will go north. But at the same time, bowhead are an Arctic species, right? So at the same time, they're going to be migrating north. So I have a hard time believing that there's going to be a lot of competition between these two species in the foreseeable future.
Right.
The same with right whales going across to the Pacific Ocean. I think it's a long shot that those populations will be intermixing at any time, especially because they're both so small that they'd have to actually have to find each other, and we can barely find them.
That's right. Yeah. And the North Pacific right whale is probably even more rare than North Atlantic right whale, surprisingly.
It is, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Next is a few questions about food. One wanted to ask you to comment on the various foods of right whales along their migration. So do they have different food along their migration route?
Yeah, they do have different food along their migration route, and their migration route is it's a seasonal migration from south to north, and it really follows the seasonal cycle of primary production in the temperate waters of the Western North Atlantic. So they come up to Cape Cod Bay in spring in the southern Gulf of Maine, in winter. And they feed there on small species of copepods, pseudocalanus, centropoges, and also early life history stages of Calanus and Marchicus. So these are tiny, sort of energy poor organisms, but there's a lot of them there, and it's a very shallow habitat. So the right whales will actually, they don't dive deep in this habitat, you can see them just sort of mowing the lawn at the surface. They do something called skim feeding, where they go along the surface, and they can just do this with their mouths open for hours and hours and hours. And we call it mowing the lawn. They mow the lawn of Cape Cod Bay, continuously filtering plankton out of the water. So that's sort of one habitat. And then in the spring, as the calanists start to mature and become lipid rich, the whales will go out into deeper waters in the Great South Channel, in the open Gulf of Maine ocean, and start feeding on these lipid-rich later stages before they go down into dormancy. So they'll still be in kind of the surface layers. And then in summertime, the calanists start to get really fat and sleepy and go into dormancy. And the right whales then come up into Canada, where our bathymetry is, we've got all these basins underwater that collect these copepods. And so then the whales will come along and they'll actually dive down 100 meters or more. And with their mouths open, they will stay in these deep layers and be subsurface feeding at that time. And that's it. And then they start over again. Then they start migrating south again, much of the population. And we don't know a lot about what they feed on kind of November, December, when they're migrating that time of year. Some people think maybe they fast, or some portion of the population fasts as they go down to Florida.
Right. That's my understanding too. And in fact, it's one of these marvels is that the pregnant females in particular, once they go down to Florida and Georgia to give birth, they don't feed throughout that whole time of both birthing and then feeding their calf as well. So I understand they're not feeding on anything down there. So that's amazing. Okay. There was another question about if the baleen structure of these whales reflects the copepod species that they're eating.
Oh yeah, I can answer that. So right whales, in fact, balenid whales, which, these are the right whales as well as the bowheads. They have the longest baleen in the world. They have these very, very long, fine baleen threads, and it sort of fits together. The different threads fit together like a very, very fine mesh. So they have huge, long baleen plates. They're very fuzzy, and then they create this mesh inside of the baleen that will filter out very, very small organisms. And scientists at Center for Coastal Studies down in Cape Cod have done some experiments on this baleen to ask what the filtration efficiency is. And it turns out this baleen is most efficient at capturing these small size copepods. So it really is, I think, a case of coevolution of the predator and its prey.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think most people think about whales as eating krill because that's something that we're all taught as a child. In fact, a whale is not a whale, They all feed on different things. These big beasts are feeding on these little tiny bugs. Some whales do feed on krills, which are sort of larger crustaceans. Some whales are fish specialists and they have baleen that can capture fish. And obviously these ones are specialists in this way. So that's amazing. Yeah. There was another question about if there's any evidence that other foods are consumed by right whales. That's a good question. I don't think right whales are known for example, eating, certainly not fish, but although they might eat them if they happen to catch one, but not likely to catch one in the method that they feed. Are you aware of any other food sources?
I mean, they are somewhat generalist in that they will capture whatever ends up in their mouth.
Yeah.
But what ends up in their mouth is really limited by what can escape from the approaching mouth of a whale. And right whales are especially slow-moving animals. And so larger organisms like krill and fish can just escape as the whale approaches them. So it's thought that will limit what they are actually targeting. And then we find right whales really targeting areas where there's ultra dense copepods, which again points to a preference on the predator for prey types that are efficient for them to feed on, given their morphology and their the behavior that they have evolved. So I think it's sort of a beautiful story, you know, of a predator being very specially adapted to prey. But as you know, Sean, right, and as you said, right whales are probably lumped in with humpback whales and blue whales and fin whales in the minds of the public, but they're not.
Yeah.
Those animals are in a completely different, I want to say family. I should know this. I'm teaching this course right now. I haven't gotten to cetaceans yet.
It's not a
so
test. We won't be giving out a grade at the end of this webinar.
Yeah, but these are the Balanopterids.
Yeah.
The right whales are the balanids. They're evolutionarily separated, and their whole foraging mechanism and morphology is different.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really important thing that I think I would want everyone to understand, is that whales are not just whales. They are extremely diverse in how they feed and what their ecology is.
Yeah.
There's another question here about if we can do anything to increase their food. And, you know, that's kind of a neat idea. For some species, they're kind of limited by their food source, and we might think that we can improve it by providing more food for them. And obviously, we talked about how the whales have changed their distribution because their food changed distribution. This is an interesting question as well. What do you think, Kim?
Well, as an oceanographer, I've studied this a little bit, and it's thought that the abundance of whale food is really driven from the bottom up. And so, you know, their productivity really relies on how much primary productivity is in the water column that year. And the amount of primary productivity relies on the amount of nutrients that are in the water, the amount of sunlight, the amount of wind and mixing. So there's all these drivers from the bottom up that are affecting the productivity of copepods over very large spatial scales. And then you've got water that's transporting these populations and mixing them. And so the scale of the spatiotemporal scale of these populations is so wide that there's really not anything that we could do that would be on sort of a large enough scale, I think, to have an impact, any kind of significant impact on the populations on the wild populations of copepods.
Right. And, you know, I think a couple of other points. These animals are not suffering because they're lacking in food. They clearly are continuing to find the food and know where to go to find it. So, you know, there's other ways that we are causing them harm than that. Although, and you've said this before, Kim, you know, we have changed how our oceans operate, and we are a cause of the change that's happening in our oceans and our atmosphere. And so we do have some responsibility. So on the short term, there isn't much we can do, but on the larger term and as a society, I think there might be more that we can do to help. So that's important as well. Okay. Another question here. Someone was asking, what kind of temperature change happened in the Bay of Fundy and the Scotian Shelf for the whales to move further up north into the Gulf of St. Lawrence? It must it have been considerable? Question mark.
Yeah, this is a really important question, because I think it can be challenging for non-oceanographers to have sort of the same context about how temperature changes in the ocean will affect biology, because it is really different than how we experience temperature on land. Temperatures in the ocean don't change very fast in general. We don't have enormous 20-degree changes in temperature every year down at 100 meters depth where these animals are dormant. So even small changes in temperature in the deep water can have very significant effects, because the deep water of the ocean is generally quite temperature stable. It's not really significantly affected by the surface warming by the sun. So when we see even temperature changes down at 100 or 200 meters depth of 1 or 2 degrees, we start to be concerned that there's something going on. And in this case, we were looking at around that range of change. And if you think of you know, a copepod, a teeny tiny copepod that has to survive all winter in 6-degree water, and that they're adapted to using up their lipid energy in 6-degree water, and all of a sudden you change it to 7 degrees and they have to operate their metabolism, right? They're ectotherms, which means they need the higher the temperature, the faster their metabolism works. So the higher the temperature, the faster they're going to use up their lipid. So, you know, even these small changes can have significant biological impacts on animals that really are looking for a fairly stable environment in which to live for the winter.
Right. So by our standards, not much, but by their standards, obviously quite a bit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Another question, do you know what the survival rate of calves is and what percentage of calves make it to breeding age? What's the main causes of calf mortality? Yeah, this is a tough question. We talked about this. I don't know if we have the direct answer to this. Every year, there's a variable number of calves that are born between 0 and 30 in the last 20 years, basically. And every year there are 1 or 2 calves that will die because of calf mortality. We've already found one this year that was an animal that just didn't, it's a neonatal mortality. But the main causes of calf mortality are the same as the main causes of adult mortality, which is they get struck by ships and they get entangled in fishing gear. And I don't have the number, and I don't think you do as well, Kim, about what the percentage of calves make it to a breeding age, but the number is small and not enough are making it to breeding age is the easy answer. But that number does exist. I'm afraid we just don't know it off the top of our head, but it's a disheartening situation, of course.
Yeah.
Next question, what would the impact be on our oceans if right whale went extinct? What would the loss of the species mean to science other than the obvious immense loss of such a creature? This is a whole area of discussion, I think, in my opinion. I'll give you a chance to jump in, Kim. I'll just mention quickly, it's been well established now, not only by ecologists and scientists, but also by economists, and the International Monetary Fund have identified the value of right whales for ocean productivity and the normal functioning of our oceans. So there is a lot of value. If right whales went extinct, we would not suddenly find ourselves knee deep in copepods. So it's not like they're controlling a copepod population. They're obviously a very low population of right whales anyway. The impact on our oceans might be not noticed at all, I think. I mean, I'd be curious what you think, Kim. It's probably not very noticeable, but the impact is much larger on our lives and in other ways. The fact that we would let a species go extinct because of our accidental uses of the ocean, you know, would be a great loss. And furthermore, I've often said this as well, if just because whales go extinct doesn't mean that the problem is gone. There are other whales in the ocean that we're also affecting in the same way that we're affecting right whales. It just so happens that these ones are the most rare. So, you know, there are some serious impacts that this would have on our ocean. In some ways, these might not be so noticeable, but in other ways, they're very important as well.
Yeah. I think in some ways, ecologically, the damage has already been done. And it was done, you know, in the 16, 17, 1800s when the population was hunted from whatever it was, tens of thousands of individuals, at least down to 300 or 400. Back when the population was large, it probably had a significant impact on biogeochemical cycling, because whale populations can have an impact on nutrient cycling, right. And they can have an impact on controlling prey populations. But right whale populations have been so small for so long that it's not intuitive to me, at least, that they are currently having any kind of significant impact as a predator. And there are lots of predators on Calanus. Predators that you don't even think of, predators like planktonic predators, little arrow worms that are floating around in the plankton, krill, you know, lots of predators that will have very broad scale impacts on the Calanus population. So I'm not sort of convinced that there would be like some huge landslide of an ecological impact if right whales were all gone tomorrow. I think that those ecological impacts would have been felt well before we were ever able to, well before oceanography was a discipline.
Yeah.
But in the case of other whales, right, humpback whales, fin whales, whales that still have very large populations, if those and are under the same threats as right whales, if those were to suddenly start to decline precipitously like right whales are now, I think we would be in trouble.
That's right.
In terms of expecting bigger ecological changes in the marine food web.
Right. This is definitely a topic for another discussion. I think I would certainly sum it up by saying we don't want to look at what we stand to lose by losing right whales. In some ways, it's what do we stand to gain by improving the population? And all evidence suggests that we stand to gain a lot in benefiting from what that would do for our ocean. So, okay, let's move on. I know right whale morphology specialized for calanus predation and that Arctic copepods are on a slightly different size scale. Is there any understanding at this point if or how the whales are experiencing changes in feeding efficiency in the newer prey field?
That's a really great question. And the answer is that the Arctic copepods are not that much larger than the temperate ones. So we're talking about the difference between 1 millimeter and 1.5 millimeters. So still well within the range that right whales can capture. And so I would expect that they could capture both with fairly similar efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, here's a couple questions here. Any new developments on the ropeless fishing systems and the testing and the results? Does it look promising? Would fishermen be able to access some funding to transfer? Can we explain a little bit about the whale-friendly fishing equipment? Once again, this is almost a whole other topic that we could talk about. I can talk about this just briefly because of some of the work that we have done. There is technology that allows fixed gear fishing to take place without buoy lines, which is probably the biggest threat to all whales, entangling whales. This gear does work. First of all, there's a lot of testing that's taking place with fishermen right now to find out if it's suitable for commercial fishing operations. And in fact, for the first time ever here in Canada, some of the crab fishermen in the Gulf of St. Lawrence fished with ropeless gear as a test process to see if they could catch crab, and it was successful. So it's underway and it's advancing. It's not here yet. There is much more testing to do, but we're on the way, and the industry is really keen to help try and find a solution to this as well. So it's coming along. Stay tuned. Next quick question. Hi, Kim. Do you think the right whales were in the Gulf of St. Lawrence before we started seeing them in 2015? Is there a way of finding that out? I wonder if we believe they only started traveling to the Gulf after 2010 because survey effort increased in that area. That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And there's a few different data sets that are being analyzed to answer that question. I mean, the short answer is right whales were using the Gulf of St. Lawrence prior to 2010. There are sightings that go back quite far, I think, even to the 1960s. I mean, there's so at least sporadically they were using the Gulf. Yep. To some extent. It may have been a limited extent, but there's a few different pieces of evidence that are coming together now that suggest that right whales are using the Gulf of St. Lawrence to a much greater extent and a more consistent extent now than they have since we began recording data on right whales in around 1980. And one of the main time series that's allowing us to address this is from Mingan Island Cetacean Study. They have been operating since the 1970s. And have since 2014 was actually when they first started to see right whales regularly. They've seen more right whales and more regular sightings of right whales in the last 6 or 7 years than they ever have before. And they've very kindly shared their data with me. So I can say that with a lot of confidence that this is not a function of survey effort. It's actually a function of more whales being in that area. The right whales had a sort of a habitat shift in the 1990s as well, where they sort of departed from Roseway Basin and abandoned that area. But during that period, those animals were found, they all piled into the Bay of Fundy. And so sightings in the Bay of Fundy went through the roof, which still puzzles the heck out of me, because these two habitats should be very oceanographically connected. So there's really still something that we are not understanding about that process. Anyways, but now the difference is there's no right, like last year was the first year, 2020 was the first year when monitoring teams saw 0 right whales in the Bay of Fundy during their surveys. Yep. So we're, you know, this is a unique situation, at least since 1980, which really is not all that far back, right? But it surprised the heck out of us.
Yeah. And definitely with respect to the life of a right whale, not that far back either, so.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Is there findings that ship noise in the ocean is disrupting their sonar and orientation? I guess we can briefly mention that these animals are not sonar users, at least not in the way that we think of it or as far as we know, so they don't tend to use it. I'm not sure if it affects their orientation at all. We know it does affect them in the sense that they need to change their calls. We know that it affects them because we know their heart rates change and their metabolism changes around ship noises. But in terms of sonar and orientation, they're not sonar users. In terms of orientation, I don't think we know of any information related to that.
Yeah.
There's another question here. I'm interested in the role of epigenetics in right whales. Do you think other stressors like trauma could be changing or affecting their DNA? Ooh, this might be above the pay scale of Kim and I. I don't think that we know much about the epigenetics of right whales. There may not be many people that know much about the epigenetics of right whales, but it's a great question. There is lots of work that's done on the DNA of right whales and a large database that's maintained so that we understand the lineages and the family trees and so on. But I don't know of any epigenetic work that's being done in this area. Veterinarians use microchips in pets, and I don't know anything about this. If it's done, could some modified version of this be possible? You know, it's complicated, and I think we've talked a little bit about this, but there is really no reasonable way to tag whales in general, and particularly right whales, in any long-term process. There's no way to embed something into them. Their bodies will get rid of it. It's difficult to read. We can't get close enough to the whales to read them anyway. If we can attach a tracking device, it doesn't tend to last for more than a few weeks at a time. And so microchips is a very good idea, something that is considered, but really doesn't seem to have a lot of practical use just yet.
Yeah. I'll just say, yeah. So the microchip process, so the microchip is inserted into the pet, and then there's a reader. So you can pick up the pet and get the reader close to the microchip. I don't know if, I mean, the microchip must have some kind of battery or something, or some kind of magnet in it, something like that. But you can't just get up to a whale and then run a scanner over it after you have a microchip in it either. It's a matter of detection. If you're close enough to it to microchip it, you are close enough to it to photograph it, and therefore you've got really the information that you need. So
yeah, no, really challenging. I mean, it's a good idea. This technology does exist, but it just doesn't seem applicable for these animals.
Yeah.
A couple of questions here, sort of related. You mentioned you'll be out in the field 1 or 2 times a year. How does citizen science help with your surveillance work? And maybe at the same time, you know, could a volunteer train their hearing to identify certain whale sounds to assist in research as well?
Yeah, I think there are citizen science programs out there for this kind of thing. I haven't done any myself because I've just never had data sets that were big enough to sort of require that level of federation and review. But yeah, I mean, there are certainly programs out there that that would do that for other species. I don't know of any for right whales. There was a photo ID competition for right whales that what's her name? Christian Can did, yeah, for right whales. That's the only big citizen science project I've heard of.
Yeah, and we should mention that people can always submit observations of right whales, or in fact any whale that they see. They can call in and submit those to a whale alert programs or DFO, and those are useful too.
Yeah, the Whale Alert app. There's an app that you can just upload your your photographs too.
Right. Another question, would it be feasible to use satellite imagery or remote sensing to locate copepod fields and therefore predict right whale presence in an area?
Yeah, this is a really new area of research, and I have seen a couple of papers recently on the detection of plankton layers at the surface from space in different under different oceanographic conditions. And there are some areas where it's worked well, like the subtropical gyres, where there's not a lot of cloud cover or other sort of stuff in the water that's that's getting into your signal. They use LiDAR to do it. Some fancy, technology.
Lasers.
Yep, lasers. And I haven't seen it applied yet to trying to measure the distribution of prey fields, especially in coastal waters. Satellite always has trouble in coastal waters because there's a lot of sediment.
Right.
And a lot of primary productivity. And even the scientists that I know that study primary productivity using satellites have a hard time in coastal waters and waters on the continental shelf because of sediment in the water column. So there may be like certain applications where it works and probably other applications where it doesn't work.
Right.
Right whales in the Bay of Fundy are primarily foraging down at 100 meters. So a satellite isn't going to really be able to help you with that particular problem. In Cape Cod Bay, maybe it might.
Right. And this will be a common answer for some of these questions. This work is underway, actually, and there's more and more work being done on it. And so related to that, next question, do you know of research that's looking at lipid content in copepods from the Gulf of Maine versus the new location right whales have shifted to, and if they're receiving the same nutrients in this same location?
I do know of a study, actually, in my lab.
Perfect. It's like they were set up.
Is working on that question right now, but we don't have an answer yet. We're still collecting data, but we've collected a bunch of samples near foraging right whales and are doing some calorimetry on
Right.
them.
So stay tuned once again. Another quick question. I'm going to run through the next few of these pretty quickly here. Would diverting ship traffic north of Anticosti reduce ship strike mortalities? The area north of Anticosti, there's an area called the Jacques Cartier Channel, and that thing is just full of whales of all species, including right whales. So unfortunately, diverting the ship traffic north of Anticosti would not necessarily reduce ship strike mortality. There is ongoing research to try and decide if there is an area where we can divert the ships that will reduce these mortalities. Is there an identified cost per whale from Fisheries and Oceans Canada? As far as I know, there isn't from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but the International Monetary Fund has identified the value of whale, and I encourage people to go check out the publications from the International Monetary Fund about the value and costs of losing whales as well. There was a number, but what's more important is they're trying to put it into those terms. Does frequent ferry traffic across the Cabot Strait between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland threaten migration of whales to and from the Southern Gulf? Yes, these are large vessels that are making regular transits across this Cabot Strait, and we know the whales are transiting through the area, so that is also a problem. Plans are underway for a whale sanctuary in Nova Scotia for beluga whales. Is there any way that we could have an enclosed protected harbor to create a right whale nursery to help boost their reproductive capacity? This is a wonderful idea, but probably not very practical either, I'm afraid. These are large, long range moving animals and not something that we could keep in a contained area at all. What kind of cooperation of fishers have you had? I think we mentioned that earlier, that the fishing community is very involved in evolving their fishing devices to try and reduce that the chance of entangling animals. Let me just see. Is there a difference between problems due to fishing, pollution, and temperatures between right whales in the Atlantic and the whales in the Pacific? I think we can say that all whales around the world are facing the same kind of pressures. Entanglement, ship strikes, pollution, and changes in ocean structure are something that's affecting all whales. And we see evidence of that both in the Pacific as well as what we're seeing here in the Atlantic as well. And I think we've gotten through most of the questions. I think the last one I'll mention leave on is you know, sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of a downer talking about these whales and the challenges they face. So someone was asking if there's any good news stories that give reason for optimism. You know, I'll give you a chance to answer, Kim. I'm a annoying optimist. I believe there is optimism for this, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, everybody, both in Canada and the US, is doing a lot of work to figure out how to protect this animal. We're not seeing the results just yet, but there is a lot of interest, and there's a lot of changes that are taking place with how we use the ocean to try and do this. And that makes me optimistic. And the other reason for optimism, of course, is that these animals are continuing to have babies and they are trying to survive. And so I'm optimistic that between those two things that you know, this is not a lost cause at all. And there's a lot of good. Anything optimistic, Kim?
I think you said it. I think you said it very well. There used to be, you know, maybe 50 or 60 people attending the Right Whale Consortium every year. Now we have to have it online because there's 200 or 300 people that want to attend and learn about this stuff. So it's really gained a lot of attention. People want to help. So.
Well, hang in there, I guess. So I don't want to see anybody giving up hope about this just yet. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Kim, thank you very much for joining me again for answering these questions. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks very much, Sean.
Okay.
Have a good day.